You might have heard that military experts around the world all agree that the United Kingdom's army is lacking, and it doesn't have the military strength it once had. Some experts even say England can't even protect themselves, let alone its allies. What happened? One of the most strong militaries and one of the biggest empires for centuries has turned into a military that's considered a tier 2 army. So if a huge war turns out, like World War III, what is the United Kingdom gonna do? They say the sun never sets in Britain because they have territories everywhere in the world. We all know that NATO is supporting Ukraine in the Russian-Ukraine war, and each country in NATO is helping their fair share. When Russia attacked Ukraine, every country in NATO, including Britain, got extremely worried. But out of all the countries, Britain was the most worried because it was forced to send most of its goods in the military towards Ukraine. And that's in a way where they're lacking equipment themselves, and they don't have the technology for new weapons. They're even being left behind by France. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Western countries thought there's not going to be a threat coming from the east side of the world anymore. But the ones that thought that probably never read history, because if they read the history, they'll know that Russia started with wars, it expanded its territories with wars, it became a global superpower with a war, and of course, it's still at war. Ben Wallace is the Minister of Defense of the United Kingdom, and he always says the British Army is lacking equipment and we have to replace it with new technology and weapons. Some other British politicians say if war breaks loose, the British Army can't protect itself for more than 3 days. But most of the British people don't believe it, and they say the government wants to tax us to upgrade their military. For example, when the United Kingdom joined the US in the Iraq War, after a few years, it was lacking power and their military budget wasn't doing its job. They always had a lack of personnel, and they knew compared to other superpowers like Russia, China, and the US, they are lacking hard. Let us turn back time a little bit. When David Cameron is the Prime Minister of the UK from the years 2010 to 2016. Since the first day he came into office, he started cutting budgets for the military. And you could say the budget that was already low for the British military was even lower under his government. Before David Cameron, there were 220,000 active personnel in the army. But after, he turned it to 100,000 active personnel. David Cameron also sold a lot of military goods. He would make an excuse that they're old and they cost money to keep, so they were either recycled or sold to other countries. David Cameron also did something that shocked the entire world. He decided to retire one of the aircraft carriers by the British Army, the HMS Ark Royal. David Cameron had created an auction because he sold 72 Harrier aircraft to America for the price of $180 million. That's insane. 72 Harriers for only $180 million. And the American government immediately paid for it. We don't know what they were thinking, but there are some conspiracy theories that say David Cameron was a US agent, and they also believe that for these 72 Harriers, they should have gotten paid $2 billion, not 180. David Cameron is in office and days pass, and the power of the British military goes lower and lower. 6 years was a good amount of time for David Cameron to mess up the British Army and weaken it. After Cameron is finished messing up the army, his term was over in 2016, and Theresa May becomes the new Prime Minister, and Brexit starts. Brexit is basically Britain trying to leave the European Union. Brexit put a huge toll on the British economy, and after Brexit was over and the UK was finally taking a fresh breath of air, Corona hit. And in the middle of COVID-19, where nothing has gotten better, the Russians attack Ukraine, and Britain, that's trying to fix up its army once again, is forced to sign an agreement with Ukraine to send them weapons. Some say Britain was sending weapons to Ukraine to replace it with better and newer ones. But after a while, it seems like they're not doing that, and nothing has been replaced. In terms of Navy strength, the UK is not looking too bad. Next to 11 US Navy aircraft carriers, Britain has 2 of them, and these 2 carriers have 65 F-35. We all know that the Royal Navy was one of the strongest navy for centuries. Even until World War II, it was considered a superpower. But after World War II, the US and the Soviet Union surpassed them. Either way, they tried to keep up throughout the Cold War. But year after year, the Navy and the Army started to fail and not keep up with the global superpowers. Right now, the best navy in Europe belongs to France, but before this, it always belonged to the United Kingdom. The British Air Force is not looking good either, because they only have 29 F-35s that are considered new aircrafts, and they have a few old Typhoons that they need to retire. They also have a few reconnaissance aircrafts that are not modern whatsoever. They say if they don't modernize their reconnaissance aircraft at least, the airspace of the United Kingdom is not going to be safe for a while. The question is this: what do they want to do? If World War III breaks loose, what does the British government want to do? The UK is one of the most important members of NATO, and that means if there's a war and one NATO country is involved, the other NATO countries have to help, and their country is a huge target in any war. If World War III breaks loose, the British government will be dependent on NATO, and it has to allow other NATO members to use its land as a base, kind of like a ginormous aircraft carrier for other NATO countries. This country with such a powerful army in history and such a powerful government doesn't even have bombers. So if there's an actual war, they have to stand behind the US. British land is an extremely important spot for the US. If China or Russia wants to attack the US, they have to go to US from the north part of the UK, and they can't go from the Pacific Ocean. If Eastern countries want to attack the US, they have to come from the Northern Sea, and that's what makes the UK's land extremely powerful. Ukraine is extremely important for Western countries, but there's also another land that's very important: South China Sea and Taiwan. China wants the land back, but the US and other Western countries can't let that happen. And what's the main reason? Microchips. The Americans took their whole microchip technology to Taiwan. If you've seen our video about World War microchip, you know how important Taiwan is for the US. Since America needs power in South China Sea, they're trying to make Australia more powerful. So they're sending them the best weapons to modernize their military. And if there's a war between Taiwan and China, Australia can help. Either way, if the UK was empty, it would be damaged heavily, and Russia, for example, could take over easily. But the truth is, the UK is not alone. It's an important figure in NATO, and if anyone attacks it, all the other NATO countries are forced to help it. But either way, it's still gonna be a dependent country, and it's not considered one of the superpowers in NATO.